The lockdown bell rang twice that afternoon. Once inside the gray brick school and once somewhere inside the town itself. A hollow echo that slid under doors and into living rooms until even the smallest rooms felt like traps. It was ordinary in the way of ordinary things. A drilled announcement read over a tinny speaker, a message practiced to remove surprise. But a practice thing can go wrong in a way that does not look like a mistake. It can look deliberate. Rachel was cutting an apple when she heard the voice on the kitchen radio. The slice of fruit pinged off the counter and lay like a pale crescent between her fingers. She hadn't moved in a long time. Time compresses when the heart is waiting. The radio voice was brusque, practiced. Please remain calm. This is a lockdown drill. It was the script she had heard before. She set the apple down, wiped her hands on her jeans, and smiled at the small ridiculousness of living with routines so strict they made danger feel scheduled. Her son Ethan was supposed to be home in 20 minutes. He would burst through the door with a backpack full of textbooks he never opened and a question about something he didn't really want to know. Could they go to the arcade tonight? Ethan was 8, earnest, with a forehead that folded when he frowned as if the whole weight of the world required a crease. Rachel imagined him cramming a French fry into his mouth on the way from the bus stop, and imagined the way he would dump his backpack on the couch like a small animal. Imagining him was a way to hold him close. Then the second announcement came, different in tone and in content, and the radio spit static halfway through. This is not a drill, the voice said. Repeat, this is not a drill. Lockdown in effect. Lockdown in effect. Rachel felt the room tilt the way it does when weather shifts. The fluorescent light above the sink hummed and warped, a thin ribbon of sound that felt like a warning. She grabbed her phone. The screen said 3 missed calls and a text from the school's automated number. Lockdown. Calls not allowed. There were other messages, too, from neighbors. Anyone here? Kids okay? Her hands began to shake. Outside, the street was a lake of late light and ordinary cars. The hedges that lined their small cul-de-sac had been trimmed into tidy clouds. Mrs. Hargrove's begonias leaned toward the sun. A boy on his bicycle circled the block twice and then stopped to look at Rachel's house as if seeing it for the first time. The limp normalcy of the suburban afternoon made her nauseous. The siren came, distant and then nearer, but it was not the comforting wail she needed. It wound itself into the air like an animal's throat and then stopped, leaving a silence that hummed. She called Ethan. No answer. The call tried and tried, then died. She checked again. No signal. She flicked the screen like turning a page. The signal bars were there, stubborn and empty. The little Wi-Fi icon winked dead. She thought, maybe the school turned off cell service during the drill. She thought, maybe it's nothing. She thought, keep calm. On the radio, there was something else now. The voice was replaced by static and then by children's laughter. It was wrong. It was not the recorded glee of recess. It had the wrong pitch, the wrong timing, like music slowed to half speed and played underwater. In the laughter she thought she could hear the rattle of chains. Neighbors gathered in small groups and made small, useless plans. Someone said they'd seen a masked figure near the west end of town, by the library. Masked men were the sort of thing you read about in headlines from places far away. Maybe a robber, someone offered, and their voice trembled. People clustered and shone their phones toward the empty street as if light could draw the answer out from the dark. Rachel left the apple on the counter and ran. On the walk to the bus stop, she ran her hands through her hair, tasted metal, felt her breath go shallow. She reached the corner where the school was visible across a belt of chain link and cracked asphalt. Maplewood Elementary sat like an island of light. The brick was the familiar, flat brown she had always associated with safety. The banner over the entrance read, in friendly letters, "Learn, play, grow." The banner fluttered in the wind, but the letter seemed to shiver, as if the phrase might rearrange itself. The playground was empty except for a single swing that still creaked in the breeze, though no one pushed it. The slide had a smear of shadow on its metal skin that looked like dried paint until she blinked. At the entrance, a small knot of parents had already gathered. A teacher with a clipboard, her mouth taut, told them to step back. A police cruiser sat in the lot with half its lights gone. Someone had taped a note to the school's glass door. Locked down in place, do not approach. The handwriting was careful and uniform. It did not match the panic in people's faces. That pause, the gap between instruction and the thing it tried to hide, made Rachel's stomach drop. "Where's Ethan?" she asked the teacher, voice sharp. The teacher's eyes found Rachel's and slid away. "We don't know," she said. "We can't get in. The doors are sealed from the inside." Sealed from the inside. The words felt like a sentence. Rachel wanted to laugh at the bureaucratic horror of it. Sealed from the inside. The image of tiny hands locking a heavy mechanism closed sent ice through her. She tried calling the school number. It went straight to the same recorded voice. "Do not approach. Law enforcement is managing this incident." The voice was placid. It had no idea. "Is there anyone watching the cameras?" Rachel asked. She could not think of anything to do besides ask for someone to tell her her son was okay. The policewoman looked at the school and then at the phalanx of parents. Her expression was thin, professional. "We can't get clear visuals," she said. "There's interference. Cameras are—" She stopped. Her breath left her face like a small white flag. "There's an area of black, like the feed drops. We can see the lobby. The gym's camera shows static. And there's an echo on the audio we can't explain." An echo of something. The radios on both sides crackled. Rachel thought she could hear it then. A little melody under the chaos, like a music box with its teeth catching. At the base of her skull, she could feel the slow burn of panic, like a second heartbeat. She pushed forward, past the police line, past the warning tape. She can't explain why she did it any better than she could explain a dream. She felt like someone in a dream who, upon seeing a closed window, will break through it just to see the other side. The people who tried to stop her were suddenly not physical enough to contain her. A nameless authority took the form of a flash of hand. "Ma'am, you can't go in." One moment later, and she was through the gate, through the door, and into the school's breath. The lobby smelled of old varnish and sun-warmed plastic. The tile was scuffed by hundreds of small shoes. A line of lockers hummed quietly, their paint chipped like the bark of old trees. Fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, but some of them were struggling, their glow pulsing like a heartbeat with a distant arrhythmia. Her shoes made no sound on the worn linoleum. The metal of the trophy case reflected her face in small, dangerous shards. Inside, a trophy gleamed. A brass athlete frozen mid-stride, awarded for a season long gone. Behind the case, the wall of plaques stared down like a list of dead names. Rachel's hands were damp. She moved through the hall like someone holding a candle in a room full of candles that shouldn't be lit. Outside, the afternoon was bright, clean, and stupid. Inside, light seemed to gather into knots and hang heavy. She called Ethan again. It went straight to voicemail, the recorded tone almost polite enough to mock her. She left a message, voice shredding in the gaps. "Ethan, listen to Mommy. Come home. I'm coming to get you." The message remained unsent in the air like a paper airplane. From somewhere deeper in the building came a sound that threw her forward, the high, thin peal of laughter. It sounded like it had been played by someone who had watched children on a screen for too long. Repeated, slowed, then shifted sideways into something almost musical. It didn't belong in the lobby. It didn't belong anywhere. She followed the laughter. It wormed through school corridors, down stairwells with handrails warmed by 100 palms,
past the science room with its dried models of the solar system that hung like suspended fruit. The sound came from the gym. The gym doors were locked. Her hand found the metal handle. It was cool and slightly sticky with the residue of someone's despair. She pried. She was not thinking clearly.
The laughter rose, louder now, and the lights flickered into a staccato. For a moment, the mirror's surface shimmered, and the reflection drew itself away from the frame, as if something being held against the glass had pulled free and stood on the other side. The reflected line of small bodies moved with a slight uncanny independence, like puppets on strings held by a different hand. "Don't touch the glass," a child's voice said behind her, flat and certain. It was Ethan, but his voice sounded like it was coming from inside a tin can. "It keeps the other side quiet." Rachel shoved through the ring. She didn't notice how her hands scraped against friends' sleeves, how sneakers made soft squeaks on polished wood. The masked figure stepped in front of her, the fabric at its shoulders whispering like a curtain on the wind. It raised its head and tilted it at an impossible angle, exposing the seam at the back where what had to be a face should have been. "Please," Rachel begged, "Ethan, baby." He looked at her, and she pressed her palm to his cheek to anchor him and to feel the fact of him. His skin was still warm enough, his breath shallow and arced like someone half awake. "We have to get out," she said. The words came out like a mechanical instruction. Behind them, the mirrors pulsed. A shimmer crawled like oil across the glass, and then a sliver opened. Not opening as in hinges parting, but opening the way skin does to let a worm in. 1,000 invisible teeth parted the surface, and a hollow that made the mirrors look like mouths breathed. From the edges of the mirrors emerged shadows shaped like children. Not full children, but the idea of children. Limbs too long or too short, hands too many joints, faces stretched as if pulled by someone impatient on the far side. They were silhouettes edged in a dim, bruise-colored light, and they moved with a hunger that was not quite animal. They pressed at the mirror from the inside, palms making smudges of the reflection, like someone trying to find the warmth of the other side. The children in the ring did not scream. Instead, their faces softened into the same kind of patient attention you give a teacher or a story that is about to accelerate. The masked figures took a step back and spread like a circle, creating space. The gem's light stuttered and then went out, leaving the room wrapped in a darkness that tasted like pennies. Rachel fought with something that was not only the room. It felt as if the mirror itself had its own will, and it wanted to keep the children looking at their own faces, as if the reflection offered more, warmth, promise, the comfortable lie of being observed and safe. The shadows behind the mirrors made a sound like hands rubbing a balloon. When the lights came back, it was like a message had been delivered. She reached for the stainless steel rim of the mirror and felt cold. Not the physical cold of glass, but the deep, clean cold of a tomb. The surface was slick with a condensation that smelled faintly of mildew and something sweeter, like the breath of someone who had been kept from air for too long. Some way inside the shimmer, Ethan's reflection smiled at her in that wrong way. He turned once and put a finger to his lips. "Shh," he said. The word cut across her like ice and burned. That was when the sound came, a voice that wasn't a child's, higher and layered but not humanly so, like the overlap of many small radios tuned to a single station. It spoke in syllables that were half song. "Stay and be doubled," it sang, and the air seemed to thicken, like a curtain cloth falling. The masked figures moved. They were not trying to hurt. They were shepherding something. The children's eyes glazed over, and they leaned forward, as if waiting for something to be read out loud. The shadows on the other side of the glass slapped their palms in rhythm with the metronome, a slow, steady rhythm of a heartbeat trying to be born. Rachel felt a pressure in her ears that made simple thought impossible. She tried to pull Ethan away, to tear him out, but his fingers clung to the wood like root. He had turned toward the mirror again, as if watching someone he knew across a room, and had forgotten its real name. She could have left then. She could have picked him up, pushed through the ring of masked bodies, and run outside into the uncertain scavenged safety of sunlight and neighbors and noise. But something else lived in her body besides fear, a thick, burning cord labeled parenthood. It tightened into a fist, and she could not let go. She had once watched a documentary about mothers diving between cars to pull kids from the street. That image of absolute, unnecessary courage sat in her like a fossil and moved. She stepped closer to the glass. Her breath fogged the surface. For an instant, she saw herself reflected, a face made small by terror, a mother who'd kept late hours, who'd baked cupcakes for classroom parties, who had broken pencils into neat little piles when the kids were bored. Her reflection blinked too slow, then stopped blinking altogether. There was a lag, and in that lag, the reflected world was different. In it, the bleachers had a child sitting in the top row with his legs dangling over the edge. In it, the gym lights did not flicker, but hung like steady, cruel moons. "Mom," Ethan mouthed, but no sound came. It was like watching a movie in which the audio has been lost. She moved her hands to the glass and pressed. For a moment, the glass accepted, but did not yield. It was not a matter of pressure, it was a matter of permission. Behind her, the gym's exit door slammed. Not the heavy human slam of a gust of wind, but a whispering paper snap that carried the reverberation of something walking. The room shifted, and the circle of children leaned in, as if the core had an addiction to a voice they could not have in the daylight. At the edge of her hearing, a thin voice started counting. Quiet, precise, as if reciting the rules of a game he had been trained to play. 1, it said. 2. The metronome ticked and then stopped. When it stopped, every head turned to the mirrors as if responding to a conductor's unseen signal. The shadows pressed like a living tide against the glass, and for a terrible second the mirror became not a division but a skin stretched over a living cavity. Tiny imprints appeared on the inside, the shapes of hands and faces pressed so hard the glass flexed. "Get away from it," someone near the corner said in a voice that cracked. The voice belonged to a small woman who had been the kindergarten teacher for 1,000 crayon summers. She walked toward the ring with slow staccato steps, as if walking into a storm. The masked figures did not stop her. She did not meet anyone's eye. She only smiled, a thin, warrior smile that looked like it had practiced courage into a facial expression. "Everyone's okay," she said when she reached the children, and there was such tenderness in it that it could have been a threat. "Nothing's wrong." Her hands ran across the nearest child's hair like a small private blessing. "We're waiting." Rachel would later tell herself that she could still remember the details. The way the teacher's cardigan clung to her collarbones, the way the child's hair smelled like sun, and the faint tang of crayons. She would tell herself that memory had a kindness to it, that there was a human center to the spiral. But later the memory blurred. In the immediate, the room felt like something folded in on itself. The mirror looked like a wound that had closed and then reopened to show teeth. Something moved from the other side of the glass. Not a hand, not a limb, but a shape of light that traced along the edge as if reading the frame. It made a slow, hungry sound. "Ethan," it said, but the mouth that shaped the name was not his. Rachel did not remember how she reached him. Memory sometimes shortens the path of those who survive. Hands became arms, became the sweep of a body, and then the press of fabric. She grabbed him and he turned toward her with an intensity that was both relief and accusation. He wanted to be away from the glass, but he also wanted something inside it. He wanted both. No child could be required to choose a single world. She turned to run. The masked figures parted like curtains, letting them through, watching with the interest of gardeners approving the removal of a weed. At the gym's exit, a shadow child leapt in a motion that would not have been possible for a child whose bones were brittle. It slammed into the threshold as if to block them, then shrink back as if shy. They made it into the corridor like animals surfacing. The doors slam-seated closed behind them with the soft finality of a trap. The school's lobby swallowed them, and for a moment there was a clarity, the jewel of panic that comes when the immediate threat is behind you. Ethan was trembling. He leaned into her and let go as if letting go of a cliff face. "We're leaving," she said, but the sentence hung with its own fragile hope. Outside, the world had rearranged itself while they had been inside. The teachers and parents that had clustered at the gate were gone. A police car sat idling at the corner as if it had been waiting for their exit. The sky looked indifferent, a bruised blue. On the sidewalk, a small puddle reflected their faces. Hers, drawn and sharp beneath the streetlight. Ethan's, small and luminous. In the puddle, the reflection of the school stood like a statement. Ordinary building, hollow light. They did not walk home. Rachel held Ethan's hand and rushed. She did not stop at neighbors' doors. She did not kiss his forehead in front of the world. She did not want to answer the questions. She only wanted to move into a place where the glass could not talk to them, and into a place where laughter had its ordinary pitch. They passed one elderly man, who watched them go with eyes like stones. He nodded at them, a small, knowing tilt of the head that was its own kind of benediction. She had the ridiculous and monstrous thought that perhaps all this could be explained by tired people, by a prank gone too far, by someone who fed on the novelty of fear. She had the equally monstrous thought that people who are tired invent small myths to keep waking up. At home, Ethan climbed onto the couch and curled up with his knees to his chest. He smelled like the school's varnish-scented air, and something else she did not recognize, something floral and rotten. He would not sleep. She would not let him. She checked for messages, stared at her phone as the numbers blinked into life, and found only the recorded voice and a chorus of other worried parents. That night, the lullaby she sang stuck to the walls like a protective varnish. Ethan's breath finally evened. She sat at the kitchen table with the weight of exhaustion pressing every joint, and only then did she feel the tremor of what she had done slide through her. She had gone into a place adults told you not to go. She had recovered a child from a setting that might have swallowed him. She would be the hero. She would be the woman who saves their child. She would be the one who had seen things no other woman would have to see. Then, hours later, when the house was black except for the glow from the refrigerator and the dead moon outside the window, Ethan slipped out of bed and padded down the hallway toward the bathroom. He stopped midway and looked back at the bedroom. The hallway light reflected off the family pictures hung in a line. Ethan at 5 with a missing front tooth. Ethan at 3 holding a lopsided frosting-smeared cupcake. Ethan with his first lost tooth pinned in a small envelope. In each photo, Ethan's eyes were bright, bright with the same mischief he had now. He walked past the hallway mirror and stopped. In the silvered glass, his reflection winked without moving. Rachel always told herself later that she had not seen it at the time, that the morning after everything had seemed safe, and that any sense of unease had been the kind of fog that retreats under the sun. But the mirror was there in the hallway, and when she passed it somewhere before dawn, she thought she heard a taste of static in the air. She thought she saw a trail of condensation leading across the frame like a finger had wiped it away. She straightened it with her hand, smudging the glass, and for a second she caught her own face, tired, anxious, and human, and she read in her son's mouth a secret he might have swallowed. They slept for a few hours. Then, at a time unmarked by logic, Ethan woke and padded to the bathroom again. The house was quiet. The clock on the microwave blinked at 3:12. He stood in front of the mirror and touched the glass. On the other side, a child leaned forward too. Later, in the bright, relentless light of a morning that pretended nothing terrible had happened, Rachel called the school and left another message, insistent and demanding. The line clicked. The recorded voice answered, "We are investigating the incident." It said it with the same calm it had used before, the same practiced cadence. There was no human warmth in it. There was only the thin veneer of an institution trying to maintain order. The children arrived to school the next day like they always did, slow, clinging to parents, noses pink from the wind. The staff moved with forced normality, their smiles stitched on. The principal read a statement through a small, smileless screen, the kind of speech designed to be clean and sterile. There would be counselors, she said. There would be safety meetings. There would be conversations about trauma. There would be an investigation, an audit, forms to fill. People needed to label the thing that had happened with manageable words so it could be filed and perhaps someday be forgotten. But the laughter had left a residue. Children who had been in the gym before that glass had shifted found it harder to look themselves in mirrors. When they did, they hesitated as if someone might be watching from across. Parents combed hair more slowly or not at all, finding it unbearable to see their children as reflections faintly wrong. Ethan seemed fine in ways only a mother notices. His hands still fumbled with his shoes the way they always had. His laugh erupted at the same silly cartoons. Yet at night he slept with a book stacked against the door, and sometimes he woke at the same strange hour and wandered down the hall without knowing the reason. He would stand in the bathroom and cough small, private coughs, and then run back to bed like someone who had been granted permission to go home but didn't know the way. For the first week after, Rachel lived in a pocket of suspension. School called to say everything was under control. The police left reports that read like dry leaves. News vans did not come. After the story's first shimmer, there was an effort to reassert the mundane. The town's forum argued in small, polite bursts about whether the event was a hoax, a psychosis, or some deeply private cruelty executed by a stranger. People sought reasons and found them shaped into the comfortable forms of casual evil. Kids playing a game gone too far, a prank staged too cleverly, a set of psychopaths with masks and metronomes. None of these explanations held in their mouths. A week later, she found a detail she could not quite dismiss, a smear on the inside of the bathroom mirror at home, like someone had tried to wipe away a child's handprint. It was faint, ridged, visible only when the light hit it. The smear had the shape of small fingers splayed. She rubbed it with her sleeve and wiped, and within a minute, the memory of its exact line was gone. Her palm came away smelling of something tinny and floral. She went to bed thinking, perhaps the world is trying to lean back into sense. Then Ethan's teacher called. "There's something else," she said, her voice sounding very small inside the speaker. "3 children in the class are drawing mirrors over and over. They draw other children on the wrong side of it. They put little hands in the drawings." She used the word weird and then said sorry as if the word itself were a social wrong. Rachel listened and felt something like a bruise form behind her sternum. She thanked the teacher. She promised to be there. At night, Ethan began leaving the light on in the hallway. Rachel kept watch then, in a different way, not with fear so much as attention. There is a type of vigilance a mother can learn that is not panicked but fixed, like a lamp. She would sit up with the glow of the refrigerator blinking through the doorway and listen to the hollow domestic sounds, the distant faucet drip in the school of plumbing, the soft chirp of a battery dying, the once regular pulse of the streetlight outside. Once, at 3 in the morning, she heard something that made her heart stop. The faint, tiny sound of a child's voice singing. It was not singing as much as it was repeating a cadence, the same rhythm she had heard in the gym. Somewhere far away, a music box had lost a tooth and made of the world a different note. She thought of the mirror children. She thought of the masked figures and their casual interest. She thought of the teacher's small, brave smile as she walked into the ring. She tried to draw a map in her mind of what had happened, and the map refused to hold. She wrote the events down, lists, timelines, and found that ink could not carve sense out of the soft place where memory and dream met. Weeks passed. The town told itself stories to feel less bad. Children returned to the playgrounds, slightly smaller in spirit. Parents traded glances like carved spoons. Rachel, willing to try anything that might keep colors of the world intact, signed Ethan up for extra activities. She watched him put his hand into his backpack in the mornings as if feeling for the weight of the world. She watched him climb the bus steps, stacked against the sound of everything that had happened. And each day when he returned, he came back as if he had been away on a small trip rather than across a threshold. And then the note appeared. It was taped to the bathroom mirror on a Sunday morning when the house smelled of coffee and old bread. She found it when she went to brush her teeth. The handwriting was a child's, small, careful letters drawn in a slow loop. Rachel read it twice to be sure. It said, "We are hungry." She tore the note down with trembling fingers, her palms slick. There was no sign of who had left it. Ethan sat at the kitchen table stirring cereal, a spoon clinking. He did not look up. He had the air of a child who had memorized a line and was waiting for the applause. Rachel folded the note into a small, tight square and put it in the cookie jar where she kept the emergency money. She said nothing. She did not tell him she had seen it that morning. That night, she left the bathroom light on and slept with the book against the bedroom door. Days later, the sound returned. The laughter was not as it had been. It had learned. It had found a rhythm like a heartbeat and matched it. At school, children mimicked the sound, half playful, half terrified, like a secret written in a childish hand that older ears couldn't quite understand. Teachers smoothed hands over tiny heads and said things like, "Don't repeat it." Adults tried to make the sound into an inconvenient memory to be disciplined away. On a late autumn afternoon, when the trees had dropped their leaves like the flaking of old paint, Rachel stood in front of the school again. She was not there to answer an alarm this time. She was there because of a flyer taped to a light post that said in blunt black ink, "Community meeting tonight. Town Hall. Children welcome." The principal, the mayor, and the police chief would be there. The flyer also included a picture of a mirror, an odd choice that made her stomach knot. News vans would not come. The story lived in small corners and never swelled. But the town had the same hunger for order that every small place does, and they wanted to make sense. They clung to anchors, meetings, petitions, mental health resources. They wanted labels. They wanted causes. They wanted an end point. At the meeting, the room smelled of coffee and old foam chairs. Parents sat in rows, the way people tuck themselves into moth-eaten things when they need extra warmth. The principal took the stage and began to speak in the bureaucratic language of damage control. "We are committed to safety," she said. "We are implementing measures." Her voice was a flat coin. From the back of the room, a small hand shot up. A child with a crooked cowlick and a face like a paper cut raised his hand. "My mom says the mirror has teeth," he said. The room made a quiet sound that might have been a laugh and might have been an intake that prepares for panic. Before anyone could answer, the lights flickered. The emergency engine sent the soft tone of a town bell through the ceiling. The projector on the stage hummed and then spat static. For a moment, the whole room sank into a slow, collective breath. Rachel felt the hair along her arms lift. From somewhere near the ceiling, or perhaps behind it, came that music box cadence, only slower, like someone had stretched a child's song by hand until the tune was raw. People shuffled. The mayor looked at his watch. The police chief fumbled with his phone and then looked up with something like guilt on his face, a small animal expression. "We have no signal," he said finally. "All transmissions are spotty. We're calling our backup now." No one giggled. No one made a joke. There was a line of white-hot silence. From the doorway, a small boy started to giggle. It was the tiny, bell-tinged sound of a child who had found the location of a secret. Others around him began to imitate. It spread like static. It rolled through the chairs and landed in the laps of grown people and made their throats thick. Rachel's hands clenched. She was not certain whether it was courage or habit that moved her feet, but she found herself rising and walking toward the back of the hall. There, by the exit, a man in a janitor's uniform stood alone, his bucket at his feet. The man looked at her as if he had been waiting a long time for anyone to come to him. He smiled with a mouth that knew the floorboards too well. "You better not," he said, and his voice had the weary cadence of someone who had cleaned more than spills. He pointed toward the ceiling. "Don't let the lights die." Before Rachel could answer, the chandelier over the stage, a single low-cost thing meant to offer dignity, winked and then blacked out, leaving a raw, starless dark that felt like a hand closing. The music box cadence took on the shape of a voice. It spoke a word without syllables, and the room answered in the only way it knew how, through the small imitative laughter that sounded like kids practicing for a show that had no audience. Rachel's breath stopped. She did not know why she felt a need to move or what moving would change, but she knew she could not sit still. The janitor's eyes met hers. "You can't trust what you see in the glass," he said. Those words were not for the room. They were for her. She opened her mouth to ask what he meant, and the janitor's face shifted into a patient, pained expression. "There are places where the mirror is thin," he said. "Places where the dividing line wears away like an old coat. We've always kept them patched. We thought they were stories. Sometimes they give a little and then they pull." He looked at the stage, at the projector, at the small gathering of people who had come for answers. Tonight's not one of our days. Tonight it wants the attention. Rachel felt the room tilt the way it had the first night in the gym, the tilt that means the known world is rearranging its furniture. She thought of the note taped to the mirror, the children's drawings at school with extra hands. She thought of the line of small faces in the gym. How each was turned toward a glass that wanted to keep them. She thought of the teacher who had walked into the circle like someone stepping into a prayer. She thought of the little note in the cookie jar, and the way Ethan had pressed his mouth to the mirror and mouthed a word that had stopped her heart. The janitor's voice stitched itself to the edges of the room. Tonight, it wants the attention. He kept his eyes steady on the stage's black rectangle, as if looking could hold the shape back. Around them, the lights hummed like an insect caught in a jar. A child's drawing of a mirror had been projected onto the screen, blown up to the size of city signs, and for a fragile second it looked less like a doodle and more like a window someone had left open. The mayor cleared his throat and tried to marshal the meeting back into calf-quiet civility. "We will increase patrols. He did not finish. The projector's bulb clenched and sighed like a living thing before giving up. A hush landed in the chairs. In that hush, the music box cadence returned, a breath of warped melody that threaded the rafters. A little girl in the second row began laughing. It sounded like a bell that had been dropped into a well and was still ringing. Others followed, not because the sound pleased them, but because their mouths found the shape of it before their minds did. It moved through the crowd, a contagion of rhythm. Rachel stood up.
The janitor's hand found hers and squeezed, an ordinary human grip on an ordinary human thing. "Don't let them learn to call it by name," he said, in a voice low enough that it could have been a joke or a warning. "Names give it permission." He was an ordinary man with a mop and a keyring that jangled like a small domestic choir. His name was Alonzo. He told stories at the sink sometimes, little ones about lost pets and broken gym lights. And no one had thought to look under his cap for more than dust. Now dust coated the room like a promise. At the edge of the hall, someone shouted. The lights went out. The room fell into the kind of darkness that makes the world feel soft-edged and wrong. Phones lit like one-off constellations. In their glow, people leaned toward each other while the music sank into the floor like water. "Please remain calm," the recorded background voice from the school's emergency feed said, as if a machine could clap a hand over a wound. It sounded tinny and unembarrassed.
The sound of impossibility had a rhythm to it now, the measured taps of a metronome from a gym half a town away, the slowed giggle that no longer belonged strictly to children. From the back, the janitor moved like a man who had made a map of small emergencies in his head. He stepped down the aisles, the rubber of his shoe soles whispering. And when he reached the stage, he climbed up and put his palms flat on the musician's blackboard. He looked like a man touching an old friend. "There's a seam," he said to Rachel, as if continuing a conversation. "Places where the school got stitched wrong." He told her, in the white space of their joined awareness, that the auditorium had been built over a cellar. When the school had first been extended generations ago, they had patched a dance studio over a sinkhole and nailed floor to floor. The seam traveled like a scar across the building. "We patched it," he said. "We painted it. We put a mirror there once to make it look nicer. Mirrors like that, thin glass, don't always want to reflect. Sometimes they want to be looked at." Rachel thought of the bathroom mirror at home, the handprints she had rubbed away, and the note in the jar. The janitor's words felt true the way a bruise is true, not to be argued with, only to be noticed. On stage, the projection flickered. The drawing of the mirror swam, and then stabilized into a photograph someone had snuck in, an old class picture with a cracked frame. The faces in the picture seemed to breathe, and between their blinkless rows, where a child's arm overlapped another, a gap had been cut like an invitation. A teacher near Rachel's elbow, eyes wide and wet, whispered, "How do we stop it?" The janitor did not answer with plans. He answered with an anecdote. Years ago, a rattling of small sounds had begun under the stage when he and a previous head custodian had stayed late to fix the heating. They had heard footsteps and the squeak of dolls. They had put down their tools and left 2 sandwiches on the stairs and called it done. The next morning, the sandwiches were gone, and a child's scrawl covered a dust-worn plank, "Come play again." It wanted to be fed, he said. He let the sentence hang in the way of someone speaking to a thing that would not be mollified by words. At that, a senior teacher stood up. He pointed to the back of the auditorium where another small, cheap mirror had been installed months ago, a strip meant to give the room a feel of depth. The mirror was silvered in the cheap way that caught light but not warmth. Tonight, it reflected only the rows of faces and a blur of moving phones. "Cover the glass," the teacher said. It was common sense. Cover, block, hide. People with good intentions pressed their sleeves to mirrors as if smudging would help. A volunteer ripped down curtains and wrapped them over the frames. For a breath, the auditorium looked like any other school hall trying to put its ordinary skin back on. But covering the glass was not a closure. In the places the fabric left air gaps, small sounds threaded through. A child's mouth forming a word behind gauze. The music box cadence flitted like a moth and found the smallest openings to rest. Alonzo walked to the stage wings and peered into the dark, where the old floor sagged. He found the hatch he'd known as a map arrow all these years. It was a trap door someone had painted over. He knelt and ran his fingers along the grain and the paint and the faint indentations of the old nails. With a careful motion, one that was neither break nor repair, he lifted the hatch just enough to admit a sliver of black. From the gap came the faintest of breaths, like air coming over a child's lips, and in it the smell of something like powder and river mud. It tasted to Rachel's nostrils like the smell in the gym, a clean chemical that wasn't clean at all. She put her hand on his arm then, a tether to the ordinary. "You can't leave it open," she said. Alonzo looked at her. "You can't seal it with fear," he answered. "You have to answer." "Answer what?" she asked. He didn't seem offended. He took a breath like someone taking a ladder down into a basement. "It wants to belong," he said. "It wants company." There are moments in which ordinary action feels like heroism only in hindsight. Alonzo climbed down into the small chalk-streaked space beneath the boards. He went with a flashlight and a mop bucket and the sort of intention that comes when you've spent your life being the one who notices the floor's thin spots. He groped through the black and found, as he had in other half-remembered nights, old playthings. A string of marbles, a ribbon, a paper crown bent at the edges. He found also the small vertical rectangle of mirror someone had wedged into an old frame to make the space look larger for a child's play decades ago. When he reached up and took the mirror free, the surface had the same smear of something that could be described as a child's palm. He set it against his knees, and for a second the flashlight treated it like a heart held in a hand. The reflection that came back at him was not his own. It had the soft, bewildered face of a child with a missing front tooth, and when the child's mouth opened, it shaped a perfectly polite hi. Alonzo stiffened. He had been doing this job long enough to learn that politesse in strange places is often a lure. He lugged the mirror upstairs, set it near the stage door, and then, without telling anyone, walked to the nearest piano and played a few low notes, like someone testing a bowl for cracks. The sound found the rafters and made the chairs vibrate softly. Children were still laughing in tiny clusters. The sound of the piano made those laughs tilt. He called quietly, "Who remembers how to sing This Little Light of Mine?" Hands rose like small flags cut out of ordinary. A teacher began the tune, because music is a lever for many things: memory, courage, the simplest insistence that the world will continue to obey rules. The song spread. It was clumsy at first. The music had an edge to it, as if notes were walking on cracked pavement. But it steadied. Alonzo put the mirror in the center of the stage and asked a child to stand before it. The girl wore pigtails, and the gap between her teeth shone like a small breaking of light. She looked into the glass and smiled. For a second, nothing happened. Then the glass fogged, and in the fog a small, damp silence uncurled. It was like the school exhaling. The metronome beat slowed. The children's laughter softened into breathing. The mirror's surface rippled, and then stillness settled across it. "Don't stare," Alonzo told them all, in a voice that was more weary than fierce. "Don't look too long. Look enough to say hello, then look away." It was not a strategy as much as a story, attention given and limited. The children obeyed as children sometimes do, with a trust that rules will keep them from harm. For 30, 60 small minutes, the song and the hands and the curtain over the mirror in the back combined like a careful first aid. People clung to the conventions of the ordinary: lights, singing, holding hands, and in that clutch the edges of the night softened. Later, when the town filed out, they said the meeting had been productive. They had policies to enact, patrols to fund, committees to form. They said the right words in the right order. But the note in the cookie jar was still in Rachel's pocket, folded so thin it was almost invisible. The mirror had been taken to the janitor's closet and covered with a blanket. The principal had made a statement and asked parents to be vigilant. The radio's recorded voice played its placid mantras and suggested counseling resources as if counseling alone could glue a seam back into place. That night when Rachel carried Ethan to bed, his hair smelled like the gym's varnish, and something floral and rotten, the janitor had said, smelled like river mud. Ethan hugged her, and for a second she felt the shudder pass through him, an aftershock. He slept with the hallway light on. She left the bathroom door slightly ajar. When she checked the mirror the next morning, the note was gone. The smear remained, a ghost smudge on the silvered surface of home. She scrubbed it with a little impatience, rubbing until her knuckles stung. The smudge blurred, but never quite vanished. Once, at an hour when the moon still kept the windows honest, she thought she heard a child's voice humming the cadence from the gym, and for a second she thought, absurdly, that perhaps the town had simply become more attentive, that kids had learned to keep their shadows in order. She would be wrong. Weeks later, a phone rang in the middle of the night at the principal's house. The recorded voice had returned and said, "Please remain calm." And then the feed went into a jitter of static. The janitor found fresh prints on the underside of the stage. Parents pulled their curtains tighter. Children began drawing mirrors with hands on the wrong side. And sometimes those drawings had to be wiped away, and sometimes they were not. And somewhere a laugh learned cadence and patience and how to slip its song through the smallest windows. Rachel kept watch in the way parents keep watch, with a small stubbornness. She could teach Ethan to say he was brave. She could not teach him to stop the minute the mirror called. One night, as she sat with a book balanced on the counter and the TV turned to a blank screen, Ethan padded into the kitchen and put a hand on her knee. "Mom," he said, voice small and earnest, "do you think they have to be hungry?" Rachel looked at him, at his down-turned mouth, at the way his small fist pressed into the fabric of his pajama leg, and the ache she had been wearing like a coat folded into a more ancient sorrow. "We'll feed them when we can," she said, the words going where she hoped they would, not into the world, but into the line between their hearts. She thought of the sandwiches Alonzo had told about, of the note in the jar. She thought of the way the masked figures had tended the children in the gym. She had seen, in their strange attentions, something like domestic patience. She didn't think she was explaining anything so much as offering a place for the fear to sit. That night, Ethan slept with the book by the door and left the hallway light on. The house held its breath and then exhaled. The laughter stayed a little further from the rooms. The mirrors that could still be moved were turned to face the wall. For now, that was enough. If this is a story about what was saved and what was not, it is also a story about how ordinary people decide, in small moments, how much to give. The janitor had chosen to lift an old mirror and set it where children could see it and sing to it until the edges smoothed. Rachel had chosen to run into a gym and press her palm to her son's cheek. Those are small acts of stubborn tenderness that do not erase the thing that reaches, only push it back to the seam where it waits. When the first arc of the town's panic broke into a shape the mayor could use, committees, forms, a press release, wide swaths of life resumed. The school added an extra circle to the safety drills and bought a new set of curtains. Parents put away the posters of teeth and playground smiles and tried to let sunlight be the boss of mornings again. But even when you stitch the obvious rents, the thin places remain. They are thin because someone looked too long, because a child's finger pressed and the glass forgot it was glass, because laughter learned the right rhythm. The janitor's mirror remained under a blanket in a closet. For now, that was enough. If this is a story about what was saved and what was not,
It is also a story about how ordinary people decide, in small moments, how much to give. The janitor had chosen to lift an old mirror and set it where children could see it and sing to it until the edges smoothed. Rachel had chosen to run into a gem and press her palm to her son's cheek. Those are small acts of stubborn tenderness that do not erase the thing that reaches, only push it back to the seam where it waits. When the first arc of the town's panic broke into a shape the mayor could use, committees, forms, a press release, wide swaths of life resumed. The school added an extra circle to the safety drills and bought a new set of curtains. Parents put away the posters of teeth and playground smiles and tried to let sunlight be the boss of mornings again. But even when you stitch the obvious rents, the thin places remain. They are thin because someone looked too long, because a child's finger pressed and the glass forgot it was glass, because laughter learned the right rhythm. The janitor's mirror remained under a blanket in a closet. For now, that was enough.
The note in the cookie jar was eaten by the daily smallness of existence. Someone misplaced it, then found it and moved it. The smear on the home mirror faded, only to return when sunlight hit it at the right angle. On a Wednesday afternoon, as the afternoons in Maplewood always do, mundane things gathered in polite sequence. Pickup time and piano lessons and the glaring chrome of a delivery truck on Main Street. Ethan came home from school with a page from art class. He had drawn a mirror on the paper, and on the wrong side of it, a small hand reached out. Rachel looked at it and felt the old cord tighten inside her chest. She did not scream, she did not call for help. She smoothed the paper with the steadiness of someone who had learned to administer calm like a vaccine. "That's interesting, baby," she said. "Can you draw me a sun instead?" He grinned, that earnest crease of forehead returning, and set the pencil down and drew a sun with too many rays. For the rest of the afternoon, until dusk put its dim thumb on the town, that small sun kept the world steady. If the mirror wanted company, it had to find it in the places where vigilance had been soft. If it hungered still, it would have to wait for openings. The time a parent glanced away while making coffee, the time a teacher sighed in the middle of a roll call. It would wait. It was patient. If you want more unsettling tales, subscribe and ring the bell. Story 2: The Night Custodian. Alonzo had been a janitor at Baldwin High for 18 years. He had keys for every door and a memory for small things. The corner where rain cooled in unexpected winters, the exact locker that jammed every Friday, the ways teenagers left ghost smells of cologne and panic behind them. He liked the night job because, in the hours when the building breathed alone, you could hear the house settling like an old friend. That week, the school was on a modified lockdown schedule for a construction crew that needed to move in and out. The crew's work had left temporary walls propped and an extra pressure in the air, like the building had been wrapped in paper. Alonzo liked to make his rounds with a radio clipped to his belt, a cheap thing that kept the hum of life distant and manageable. The radio did not warn him of the kind of thing that had happened at Maplewood. No feed had enough bandwidth for night things. He found the first wrongness by accident. A strip of stage board had come loose in the auditorium, the same seam Rachel had stood above that week in Maplewood. He knelt to clear a splinter and found below it a hollow full of old props. Feather boas, a paper crown with sequins, a cardboard castle whose paint had yellowed. Among the detritus, there lay a mirror about the size of a lunchbox, its edges taped with duct tape that had yellowed to the color of old teeth. Alonzo had seen mirrors before. He had found them in attics and closets, and once lodged behind a theater's old set, where it had been used to create the illusion of depth. Mirrors, he knew, could be illusions and traps both. He set the small mirror on a folding chair, and, out of a habit that had nothing to do with metaphysics, wiped its face with the sleeve of his jacket. When his sleeve came away, the glass had a dampness that smelled like the bottom of a river. On that glass, the reflection that returned was not his, but a slumped silhouette of a child with a missing tooth, and a scrawl of small letters on the inner side said, "Come down." The message bled at the edges like it had been written on wet paper. He shoved the mirror into his bucket, wrapped it in rags, and carried it up through the backstage corridors. The floorboards had that dry, tired give that older buildings get, a kind of memory in their bones. He thought of the sandwiches he had left once, and the scrawl that had appeared. He thought of Rachel's story from Maplewood that had come around the community like a small, patient rumor. He thought of the town meeting and the way covering glass had not quite ended the music. When the cleaner crew left each night, Alonzo locked down. He tried to keep the school in a state of neat order, the gym arranged properly, the lockers lined up like teeth, the empty desks like votive candles. But that evening there was the thud of something different, like a child's shoe dropped from height, beneath the stage hatch. Alonzo went down. In the hollow beneath the stage, there was a low humming chorus, as if a dozen small throat voices were trying to sing a single lullaby and misremembering the words. The small mirror in his bucket rattled like a pet in need of attention. He set the pail down and shone his flashlight into the deep. The beam found a corridor of dirt and the gold foil of old decorations. It found also an opening, not a formal door, but a seam in the foundation where the poured concrete had failed and left a small crawl space. From that crawl space, a faint light breathed, like the light trapped and held in a mason jar's belly. When the light pulled on the far wall, it showed drawings, charcoal sketches of hands, of children, with the words, "Let me in," scrawled fierce and tiny. Alonzo had been a man who thought in practical ways. He fetched his bucket of cleaning solution and a cloth and began to scrub the chalk away. The act was absurd in its ordinariness, soap on a child's plea, but it gave him the illusion of agency. The chalk smeared and then bled, and where it bled, it left a faint blushing stain that would not be removed. "Stop," a voice said from the dark. Alonzo was not frightened exactly. He was wary in the kind of way a worker is wary when a pipe begins to whistle oddly. He trained his light within the crawl space, and there, beyond the chalk and the dust, something moved. It was not a child in proper measure. It was an impression of a child, sleeves too long, fingers blurred between joints, smile that formed wrong at the edges. It tapped the glass of some internal mirror as if playing a game of knocking. It tapped and hopped back and then tapped again. The sound had a metallic quality, like marbles against metal. Alonzo knelt. He had in his years won the trust of many small things simply by showing up. He spoke, not to bargain but to offer an ordinary human presence. "Hey," he said, "you hungry?" The creature cocked its head and then made a small sound that was not exactly laugh and not exactly sob. It was the sound of waiting. Its hand, if that is what you could call it, flattened against the dark as if it wanted to push through and touch the mop bucket where his mirror lay. He could have sealed the seam. He could have called someone. He could have stepped away and let facilities decide policy. Instead, he sat there and, for reasons that were equal parts curiosity and pity and a lifetime of saying there to things that made odd noises, he untied his lunch bundle, took out a sandwich, and set it on the dusty concrete. The creature watched. A tiny nose that was more shadow than feature breathed, and the sandwich was gone in a polite, impossible way. The seam sighed. The first time Alonzo smelled it, then, he thought of river mud and powder. He did not have a name for what he smelled because it had not needed one until the town had started telling itself stories. When the school opened next morning, there were no missing students. There was only the memory of a sandwich eaten beneath the stage and a faint line in the concrete where chalk had been scraped away. The little mirror was gone from his bucket. The janitor threw the rag into the laundry and watched it spin a while like a planet shedding storms. He went about his work because work was what kept things sensible. He pushed a broom through emptiness that ponged of old plays and of the quiet things people leave behind. The hallway lights flickered once in a staccato that made him pause. He put it down to wiring. That night, the town's email list blew up with stories. A locker had been found ajar. A kid said he'd heard singing from beneath the stage. A teacher swore a poster on her wall had shifted. The school principal called a meeting and said soothing things about repairs and inspections. Alonzo said nothing. He kept his keys in his pocket like a charm. A week later, the construction crew tore out a section of the auditorium floor to reinforce beams. They found the crawl space enlarged, as if something had been scratching from the other side, as if the concrete had given way to a patient pressure. They found tiny handprints scored into the underside of the stage. They found also a set of children's things arranged like altars. A marble, a paper doll with folded limbs, a small brass bell whose clapper had been deftly bent into a heart. "Who's been down here?" the site manager asked.
"It was me," Alonzo said. "Left them a sandwich." His voice was steady and stripped of show. The men laughed in the bored, macho way that men laugh when something unknown isn't touching their lives directly. They chalked it up to kids with flashlights. They called in the inspector, and the city found legalese for the problem: a subsidence, a failing seal. They poured concrete. They patched with professional hands. Alonzo watched the men work, watched them smooth over the scene with the effortless confidence of people trained to make things look finished. For a day, he felt a small hollow of relief. Then, while walking down a corridor to empty a trash bin, he noticed a child's drawing stuck under a door jamb, pencil strokes in the shape of a hand, the word "please" written small at the corner. He removed the paper and folded it in a pocket. He began to understand that the thing below the stage had not wanted supper. It had wanted acknowledgement. The construction crews made a tidy job of the concrete, and the inspectors stamped their papers, and the principal sent an email announcing that a repair had been completed. The town accepted this. People like closure. But closure was a surface thing. Under the floors, memory sits like a slow water that moves in currents no one sees. The mirror that had been tucked away somewhere, perhaps under a tool bench in the janitor's closet, warmed in the dark like a small, potent seed. Sometimes at night when Alonzo walked past the school's side window, he thought he saw movement like heat light. Sometimes he swore the janitor's closet keys jingled when no one was there. He began to go down into the afternoon with the small act of leaving a sandwich in the janitor's hollow. It was a superstition masked as compassion. He didn't know if feeding it what it asked would stop it wanting more, or make it more patient, or teach it manners. He only knew he preferred having a trade with the thing below the floor. One sandwich per night in exchange for the light in the hall that did not stutter 3 times on Friday. Months drifted. The auditorium was used for a few plays and a graduation that everyone attended with the fine, strange joy of ordinary ceremonies. Alonzo sat in the back during the recitals and found he could not concentrate on the lyrics because his mind kept keeping the scene. Was this song a shudder or an invitation? Sometimes, when the audience applauded for a child, Alonzo thought he could hear a second, smaller applause answering from beneath the stage, the sound of little palms against wood. Once, late after graduation, he found the mirror again. It had been moved and wrapped, perhaps by the wind or perhaps by someone who had once thought to hide it. He unwrapped it, and the reflection that returned was not the face of a man in his 50s, but the faint, wet image of small teeth and a hand cupped to a mouth. The mirror was intent. It wanted to show, to be seen, and in wanting it was like a person in love. Alonzo did not smash it. He did not throw it away. He slid it back into the hollow and set a sandwich on the concrete. Then he went home and slept like a man who had done what he could, which is often all human beings can do. Story 3. Reflections don't always lie. Miss Lena Varela taught sophomore geometry. She had a habit of bringing a thermos of tea to class because calculations are a long, steady thing and tea is a patient partner. Her students liked her because she was exacting but not cruel, because she could describe a theorem like a poem without making it a trap. The day the school's lockdown began, Lena was grading papers by a window that looked out onto the parking lot. A drill had been scheduled. The administration had sent an email. The principal's voice had recorded a practice tone. The classroom hummed with the nervous energy of teenagers, hunched shoulders and earbuds, and the way fingers tapped rhythm on desks. The practice announcement came through the intercom, and the teacher next door gave a little theatrical gasp. "Another drill," one boy said and rolled his eyes. Some students grumbled. Others took the half-hour to nap. Lena smiled, despite the way the smell of disinfectant made her throat tick. Minutes later, the drill shifted. The intercom's voice lowered and did not use the word drill. It told the school to secure doors and wait. Lena watched as her students' reflexes changed. Chairs nudged to form a small barricade. Phones were turned to screens that would not light. The clock on the wall kept measuring minutes with an indifferent phosphorescence. "Phones out," she said softly. "Keep quiet." At first it seemed ordinary, the way drills can taste like theater. Then the windows took up the wrong aspect. The glass that used to faithfully render the parking lot instead returned a late afternoon that had not been recorded. In the panes, Lena saw a row of students who were not her students. They were slightly off. A girl who had not been present that day with a braid that went too long. A boy whose eyes had an uncanny brightness. In their reflections, mouths lagged behind the motion of actual mouths. She called roll, and the mouths in the glass moved a moment after the heads in the desks. She watched a student's reflection smile before she herself felt the urge to grin. When she crossed the room to help a boy with a construction of angles, his reflection stood still and turned toward the window and lifted its hand in a small, insisting beckon. "Stay seated," Lena said. The students obeyed because she was their world in the moment. She felt the faintness at the edges of her vision, like a migraine forming, a pressure that made straight lines crumple. The intercom crackled. "Remain in your rooms," the voice said. "This is not a drill." The windows did not show the parking lot anymore. They showed a hallway that curved like the inside of a shell, lined with lockers whose paint had sloughed into strips. Moving figures paced the hall, but not the dull, sleepily aggressive gait of slack teenagers. These moved with a composed, puppet-like timing. Lena watched one of her students, Maya, turn in her seat and look at the window and then look again at Lena. Her mouth was open, whispering something that would not come into the room. Maya's reflection in the glass pressed its palm to the pane, and the movement made a faint smear of condensation as if breath had fogged the barrier. Lena felt the way an instructor feels when a test question is posed by silence. She called out, voice steady, "Maya, stay with me." Maya's eyes found hers, but there was a distance. The girl looked as though she inhabited two time frames, one with Lena's warm classroom and another with a corridor where voices whispered in a scale the human ear is only trained to ignore. In Maya's left hand was a small folded paper with a drawing of a mirror and a hand traced on the wrong side. Lena had seen that motif before. The repetition made her chest ache. She moved to the window and touched the glass. It was warm and gave a little, like the surface of a forehead. Her reflection smiled in a delayed way, and when she lifted a hand, the reflected hand remained at her side a fraction longer. She was the adult. She could draw a line where children are to be kept safe, and she could not allow fear to leak into cunning. In the hallway outside, there was the sound of someone whispering, counting, the slow 1, 2, like a lullaby that had been used to train attention. Lena could feel the air press. She thought then of Rachel and of the gym mirrors and of what it might be to be a reflection. A reflection looks back, composes itself in imitation, and hopes to be recognized. Lena wondered what it would mean if the reflecting surface had a mind, if it preferred the life of imitation to the life of the original.
Some students began to clap their hands in time with the cadence without being told, as if mimicking were the easiest way to be safe. It was a nursery strategy to copy what others do. One by one, the small, mirror-obsessed doodles in class took a new life. Sketches of hands appeared in notebooks, traced and shaded and labeled, "Please." She had a choice. She could order them to stop, to hide, to fold themselves into nothing. Or she could use the only power an adult has in that kind of moment, the power to insist on attention, to redirect the group's focus with purpose. Lena picked up a marker and wrote in big, bold letters on the whiteboard an instruction both practical and simple. Name what you're grateful for, one thing. It was a teacherly trick, gratitude as anchor. She told them to speak it into the room. The words were ordinary sunlight. One by one, students named small things: a dog with a lopsided ear, a grandmother's cinnamon rolls, a car that played their favorite song. The sounding was clumsy at first. The air did not like to be reminded of ordinary brightness.
Still, there it was, a small filament of humanity that did not bend to the mirror's will. Outside, through the window, Lena saw a reflected version of the class adopt a different posture. The mirrored people began to recite what Lena's students had already said, like a chorus learning to copy. There was a pixelated patience to their imitation that made her skin prickle. The windows had learned a script and were trying to put it on. She stepped back and then forward again. She did not break the glass. She did not need to. Instead, she walked down the row and placed a hand flat on Maya's desk. "Your voice matters," she told her. "Look at me and tell me one thing you remember about summer." Maya's face, live and unflickered, crumpled with relief like a page folded back into place. She named something small, a song on the radio, and Lena let the syllables sit in the room like a small, clean stone. The mirrored Maya said the same thing minutes later. But because the living Maya had said it first, the copy had lost a certain luster. In imitation, there is also the hint of belatedness. As the lockdown elongated into a dark evening, students began to nod off, lulled by the sameness of the copied voices outside. Lena kept them engaged with numbers and poems and memory games until finally, slowly, the door was unlocked and officials allowed a dutiful stagger of parents to collect their offspring. No one announced victory. No one claimed they fixed the problem. The school's windows looked like anything: glass, hardware, frames. Outside, cars hummed by. Inside, the teachers folded the hours back into neat rectangles. Maya left holding a parent's hand, and when they turned away, Lena noticed the parent's reflection lagging a hair behind the motion. She watched the mirrored parent smile a split second after the real one had looked away, and in that delay, there was a long, cold space. In the days that followed, Lena found students glancing at windows with a new suspicion. Mirrors in her house were covered for a time with towels. Students in other classes spoke about seeing hands in paint that didn't belong to them. The hallways gathered new etiquette. Don't look too long, don't trace patterns, don't let drawings of hands sit too many days on a desk. Months later, Lena found an envelope left on her car's windshield. Inside was a child's drawing, a window with a small person knocking on the other side, and beneath it a single sentence in pencil: "Thank you." She did not know if gratitude had mended a seam. She only knew that for the time being, the windows kept their face to the world and did not try to live on the other side. Story 4. The Watching Room. Jake had the kind of job that made him feel like a small god some nights. He was a security guard at Westbridge Middle, and his domain was a room full of monitors. "Watch this camera," the job said. "Watch that hall." He liked patterns, and the hum of the screens was a kind of benign music. He could see the students moving in their rooms, and then superimposed over them another set of figures, tall and thin, as if someone had painted in charcoal a second set of inhabitants. His hands shook. He had the technical knowledge to isolate loops. He did not have a box to put a thing like hunger into. If machines would not be trustworthy, he would have to become human again. He thought instantly of physical presence, not how to break into a room, but how to be a witness. He walked the halls. The stairwell was cold and smelled of rubber. The air had a careful, watched quiet to it. He went to the library annex and found that the stacks were misaligned. On a reading table, a child's jacket lay folded with a care that looked like someone had pressed a hand there and left. At the annex window, the reflection did not match the corridor. On the screen back at the control room, the overlay showed children playing, and then, a slow cut, the overlay's children began to press their palms to the world like an artist tracing a form in fog. Jake understood that whatever was happening had learned to use the very tools he had been trained to trust. He also understood in the marrow of himself that some answers do not arrive by unplugging machines. They come by offering your own presence in the right shape. He sat on a table by the reading lamps and began to speak out loud, not an instruction, but narration. He read out names from the absent teachers list. Eli, he said, Joanna, Malik. He read birthdays and the names of pets. He did not expect reply. He expected to arrange the air in a pattern human-sized. In the control room, someone watched him on camera and, noticing his odd behavior, called over on the radio. "Jake, you okay?" "I'm here," he said. What he found strange was this. The more he spoke, the less the loops wanted to repeat. The overlay flickered like a candle gusted by a small wind. On screen, a child's hand in the overlay stilled. A tiny face that had been trapped in a loop seemed to catch the cadence of his voice and let it form its own breath. Jake moved through the building and found small acts to perform. He turned lights on in rooms the way you might wake sleep. He sat under a fluorescent flicker and hummed a simple song. He knocked gently on doors and left the sound of his knock like crumbs for the lost to follow. At midnight, he sat again in the control room and watched as the overlay broke apart into 100 neat atoms, the kind of technical term that left a human feeling small and brave. The stairwell's loop cut off. The cafeteria returned to being empty again. The monitors recorded the present. He went home at dawn with the exhaustion of a man who had stayed awake guarding a child's dream. When he slept, he dreamed of monitors turning into windows and windows into mirrors, of small faces pressing palms to the other side. Months later, a feed hack hit the nation's news. A glitch, they said. The school's CCTV had recorded an anomaly, and then a scientist offered jargon in a calming tone. Parents smiled uncertain smiles and said, "Technology," as if that could explain the smell of river mud or the child's request scratched into concrete. Jake kept his job. He kept an extra thermos in his locker. Sometimes he would walk by the annex window and leave out a paper bookmark with a scribbled note on it, "Be here." Sometimes the book returned to the shelf with a new curl in its corner that suggested someone had read it and wanted more. He didn't know who. He didn't have to. Story 5. The Live Feed. They called themselves the Night Streamers, 3 friends who made content in a world that wanted attention. They were teenagers who had learned to turn the unruly hours into traffic magnets, dares, pranks, the low, excited wire of a watchful audience. They were irreverent, hungry for likes, and excellent at turning the mundane into spectacle. Their stunt was simple. Pretend to stage a lockdown in their old middle school after hours. Run through the halls with flashlights and cameras, get a few scares, then post the footage for laughter. They rationalized everything the way teenagers do. Rules are suggestions, reels are currency, and the town's recent nervous stories would make their video trend. They hacked the school's security system the way bored kids hack anything. with curiosity and amateur bravado. The drill was to be a social experiment. They live-streamed on a platform designed for ephemeral attention and boasted about their viewer numbers in one breath. What they did not know was that attention is a two-way street. When you point a lens into an open seam, the seam begins to point back. The stream began with good humor and bright-eye commentary. "This is historic," Tosh said into the camera as they crept through atriums, their flashlights slicing like knives. Followers spooled in and put hollow laugh emojis in the stream. They ran jokes about the janitor and the school's haunting and posted a filter that made their eyes too large and their smiles too sharp. At the stage, they found the hatch. It had been patched, but the patch hummed as if it remembered its old complaint. Tosh crouched, camera on her torso, and peered into the gully.